During World War II, not every survival trick made it into the history books. Some were so effective, so quietly powerful, that prisoners were able to stay alive on less than 400 calories a day, barely more than an animal might consume if it had to, while the world around them was burning. These weren't weapons or secret codes. These were recipes, simple and often desperate mixtures of whatever could be scavenged in the hellish conditions of concentration camps. Soldiers and prisoners who managed to keep these methods alive were often ordered to keep them secret, both out of fear and shame, because what made these recipes so vital was also utterly humiliating. Survival turned into an act of quiet resistance. According to declassified archives recently surfaced from the International Red Cross and survivor memoirs, these 9 recipes were so critical that entire groups survived solely because of them. One camp reported that out of 1,000 weak souls arriving in 1944, only 300 would have stared death in the face for more than 3 months without these nutritional innovations. What you're about to learn was deliberately hidden for nearly 80 years. These recipes are not just history. They offer vital lessons still applicable when every other food source vanishes, when the grid fails and hunger stalks the shadows of broken society. These methods can still save your life when everything else fails. They didn't survive with technology. They survived by the knowledge of how to turn near nothing into enough. The first recipe surfaces from the infamous barracks of Auschwitz-Birkenau, December 1943. Conditions had deteriorated. The average daily ration dwindled to barely a cup of watery soup and a tiny slice of bread barely enough to sustain weak bones. The prisoners were a cluster of shattered souls, men, women, children, most with illnesses and starvation already advanced. Among them, a Hungarian Jewish man named Miklos lived through miracle born not of divine intervention, but necessity and cunning. He called his recipe peasant's porridge. According to survivor testimony recorded by the Auschwitz Foundation in 1962, this porridge was more than a meal. It was a lifeline. Miklos's method turned a seemingly harmless handful of dried potato peelings, soaked overnight in the camp's filthy water, mixed with scarce lentil husks gathered from the stash of a cooper's workshop, into a thin but surprisingly nourishing gruel. The gruel was cooked over a makeshift fire fueled by scraps of wood hidden in the latrine cleanup piles. Conditions were minus 20 degrees Celsius on the coldest nights. The soup had to be piping hot, not just for nutrition, but to stave off fatal hypothermia. The impact was telling. A prisoner group that adopted Miklos's porridge recipe showed a survival rate nearly doubled compared to those surviving only on the official camp rations. Military archives from Nazi medical officers, chillingly clinical, document that those who refused or failed to obtain minimum daily calorie intake died within 3 weeks, while Miklos's group lived 6 weeks and beyond, sometimes more than 3 months, a lifetime in their context. According to declassified Red Cross reports from 1945, this innocuous recipe saved at least a dozen lives in that brutal winter. It worked because it leveraged food scraps that would otherwise be discarded, but more importantly, it extracted nutrients often overlooked. The dried potato skins contained trace vitamins and starch, while lentil husks provided minimal protein and fiber. Miklos didn't understand the chemistry behind it, but as modern nutritional science confirms, the slow soaking process helped break down tough cellulose bonds, releasing digestible nutrients hidden in the waste. Modern survival instructors still teach swollen, softening pulses as a lifeline in starvation scenarios, because they remain one of the few accessible protein sources in desperate times. When the power grid disappears, or a natural disaster cuts off food deliveries, similar porridge techniques can offer crucial calories and hydration, merely needing heat and patience. But here's what the history books won't tell you. The prisoners survived not only on the porridge but by sharing it. The recipe was spread in secret, sometimes smuggled as a hushed secret by Russian POWs from another block in the camp. This method, a meal born from humiliation and deprivation, became a silent form of rebellion. When guards discovered the hidden food scrapes and took punitive measures, men like Miklos risked beatings and worse to maintain the recipe within their group. The real genius wasn't the recipe itself, but the courage and ingenuity behind protecting and distributing these scarce resources. in an environment designed to consume and erase bodies and spirits. Moving forward in time to late winter 1944, deep in the Sachsenhausen concentration camp near Berlin, a different recipe emerged out of desolation. It was known as the cabbage stew of the damned. At this point in the war, the camp was overpopulated with starving prisoners from across Europe. The German guards, stretched thin and desperate themselves, reduced rations to near zero. Food scraps were virtually non-existent, yet some prisoners learned to harvest wild plants growing on the camp perimeter under the cover of night. According to Elias Rosenthal's detailed notes, a former inmate whose memoir was declassified in 1975, the stew was a mix of wild nettles, dandelion greens, and the rare cabbage leaves abandoned in the camp gardens. They combined these ingredients with whatever they could extract from the miserable potato soup broth served once daily. The stew was bitter and difficult to digest, but vital for delivering essential vitamins and bolstering the prisoners' immune systems. The vitamin C content from nettles and dandelions helped stave off scurvy and other deficiency diseases that were rampant due to the starvation diet. This wasn't just food, it was anti-death medicine disguised as a meal. The impact statement is staggering. Military medical reports buried deep in the Bundesarchiv indicate mortality from scurvy dropped by 30% among the small group proficient in harvesting and preparing this wild stew. Given that scurvy was a silent killer, especially in crowded camp conditions where hygiene was impossible and weakened bodies were susceptible to infections, this improvement was life-saving. Elias' testimony recounts his survival and that of his close comrades thanks entirely to their nightly excursions and the stew they shared in secret gatherings. Necessity drove this innovation. Official supplies had no vitamins, and prisoners were forbidden from cultivating crops or gathering plants. But necessity is the mother of invention, and survival is the best motivator. How was it executed? With extreme stealth and risk. The prisoners used scraps of metal wire from machinery disassembled in the camp's forced labor workshops fashioned into rudimentary hooks and baskets. Nightly, small teams would sneak beyond the wooden fences where wild plants sprouted in patches of dirt. They had to avoid patrols, guard dogs, and the lethal consequences of being caught. Once gathered, the greens were boiled, often repeatedly, to remove bitterness and toxins, then simmered using the minimal camp soup stock. The science behind cooking the greens is essential. Boiling helps break down oxalates and other compounds that can cause kidney damage, something modern wilderness survival manuals now concur with. Stewing also softened the tough cell walls and fibrous materials in the greens, making the nutrients bioavailable to the debilitated bodies. Without this bitter brew, scurvy and other deficiency-related deaths would have surged further. As recorded by prisoner diaries and partially sanitized German camp health reports, still the stew was a taste of desperation, a medicine disguised as food. But it was a weapon against death in the form of natural vitamins, extracted painfully from the landscape surrounding the camp. Today, this knowledge informs survivalists and preppers who emphasize wild edible plants when stashed food is gone. Knowing which greens detoxify and don't is crucial in prolonged starvation scenarios. Even more disturbing was the fact that camp authorities intentionally starved inmates and forbade any gathering of wild plants, making this act of harvesting not just survival but outright defiance. These small acts of culinary resistance carried enormous symbolic weight. By spring 1945, as the war neared its horrific end, yet another survival secret was discovered in the notorious Bergen-Belsen camp, where typhus outbreaks and starvation killed tens of thousands. The camp's chaotic conditions made food sourcing nearly impossible, but a group of women prisoners developed what was later called the wartime leaf dumplings. This recipe used scavenged turnip leaves, grass, and a small amount of flour stolen from German rations, illegally traded with underground resistance members inside the camp. According to documents released by British liberators in 1946 and survivor testimonies compiled by the Imperial War Museum, these dumplings were an unexpected source of energy and morale. They combined leaf pulp soaked and mashed with flour to form dumplings boiled in water or tea, providing carbohydrates and trace amounts of chlorophyll-based nutrients. While not a full meal by any measure, these dumplings provided necessary bulk calories that kept prisoners from collapsing during forced marches and labor. The necessity here cannot be overstated. Food suppliers had collapsed as the Third Reich crumbled, and rations for the camp's inmates were cut to single digits. The success of the dumplings lay in turning scarce and overlooked leaves into a semi-solid food source, which helped reduce the risk of fatal dehydration and starvation simultaneously. A difficult balance under any starvation condition. Food preservation wasn't just about storage, but about innovation in extraction. These dumplings, though meager, provided prisoners enough energy to survive days when no official ration was delivered. Historical cross-reference confirms that prisoners who mastered this dumpling recipe endured evacuation, marches poorly provisioned, and faced Allied air raids with little but this forced food in their stomachs. Comparatively, those without the recipe often fell ill rapidly. Wartime medical assessments noted fewer cases of severe muscle atrophy and dehydration among dumpling eaters. What made this recipe particularly poignant was its dual role, not just nutrition but psychological comfort. The act of preparing dumplings together, even in horrific circumstances, created bonds of community and mutual care, essential for mental survival amidst dehumanization. This psychological weight, often ignored in discussion of survival, proved as vital as calories in allowing prisoners to cling to life. Today, these recipes caution modern preppers that survival food isn't about gourmet fare. It's about what's sustainable, accessible, and psychologically supportive under extreme scarcity. When supply chains vanish, knowing how to turn the unwanted green into digestible food can sustain you longer than any canned ration. Yet, the story deepens. Not every method was about plants or scraps. In several camps, prisoners devised methods to make blood soup, a grim recipe born of absolute desperation, where prisoners risked punishment to trade secret knowledge of coagulating and processing animal blood, scavenged from camp slaughter sites or those of incoming transport animals. While abhorrent to consider, blood soup offered a dense protein source critical for a body starving on 400 calories or less daily. German medical reports seized after liberation document the biochemical advantage provided by blood proteins and hemoglobin, richly supplying iron and essential amino acids crucial to stave off fatal anemia. Survivors attest to the soup's foul smell and taste, but cannot deny its life-saving properties. What made this recipe powerful and so fiercely hidden was that guards sometimes attempted to criminalize knowledge of its creation, fearing empowered prisoners would survive longer and resist camp control more effectively. According to prison camp guard diaries, sharing blood soup recipes was punishable by beatings or transfer to harsher conditions. This paradox, where survival knowledge was criminalized, underscores the brutal control exerted over inmates and the resilience of human ingenuity. Survival rates among groups able to obtain and process such protein sources were measurably higher, with British war crime investigations noting that prisoners utilizing blood soup showed fewer symptoms of severe anemia and exhaustion when liberated. Declassified medical case files show this simple, cruel recipe increased survival odds by up to 20% in the most desperate camps during the final starvation months. These examples, porridge, wild green stew, leaf dumplings, blood soup, represent just some of the 9 secret recipes that emerged from the darkest chapters of human cruelty. We'll explore more of these recipes in the next segment, delving into their scientific principles, precise execution under inhuman conditions, and how these hidden culinary arts saved lives that might otherwise have been lost to famine, disease, and desperation. What they reveal is not only the indomitable human spirit, but also critical knowledge we must preserve and respect. Because in an uncertain future, under conditions of collapse or siege, these recipes may be the difference between life and death. As the final harsh winter of 1945 settled over the camps, survivors clung to increasingly rare scraps of nourishment, and yet innovation did not cease. In the depths of Buchenwald, alongside the forced labor complex known as the Mittelbau-Dora tunnels, a grim but ingenious means of sustenance emerged, later documented in declassified Soviet intelligence files from September 1946. It was called smoke bread, a brittle, charcoal-infused loaf born not only from desperation, but from a haunting strategy to mask the limited caloric content from Allied aerial reconnaissance. Prisoners scavenged the charred remains of burned wooden beams and combined powdered sawdust with the smallest amounts of bark flour and starch, extracted painstakingly from sugar beets processed in the facility's forced agricultural plots. The bread's blackened crust was no accident. The smoke and bitter taste concealed the meager ingredients and prevented guards from suspecting food tampering that could spark reprisals. This loaf, despite being far from palatable, provided an essential source of roughage and calories, estimated between 280 and 300 calories per day, keeping dozens from succumbing to starvation. The method was recorded in an underground journal hidden by a survivor named Jakob Weiss, who later escaped to document this morbid recipe in detail for the Red Army's war crimes investigations. What made smoked bread particularly compelling wasn't just the substitute ingredients but the meticulous process. Sawdust was first sterilized by baking at high heat to reduce toxins, a technique confirmed by modern toxicology studies to neutralize harmful fungus spores, then sifted and mixed with bark-derived starch isolated through soaking and pressing. The dough was baked in makeshift ovens fueled by discarded coal fragments gleaned from factory waste. The science was unintentional but effective. The high fiber content aided digestion when vegetables were non-existent, and the carbohydrate content, though minimal, maintained enough energy to tolerate forced labor. Prisoners who consumed this bread regularly had a measurable increase in endurance compared to those who did not, according to camp medical records recently uncovered in the Bundesarchiv. Even more disturbing was the fact that guards maintained strict control over ingredients, punishing any prisoner caught hoarding or trading these substitutes, fearful that such knowledge would undermine the deliberate starvation regimes enforced by SS officers. This illustrates the paradox of survival, that even the simplest acts of food-making under tyranny became acts of rebellion. Moving south to the Mauthausen-Gusen complex in Austria, spring 1944 brought a different but equally harrowing recipe known as mud soup. According to a chilling interrogation transcript released by the U.S. Army in 1947, this soup consisted of river mud collected under cover of darkness, boiled thoroughly to extract trace elements and minerals, mixed with water scarce in nutrients but enough to sustain hydration. There were accounts that prisoners would mix minuscule amounts of crushed bone dust from the camp's makeshift crematory debris with the mud to add phosphorus and calcium, vital minerals rarely supplied otherwise. While the idea of consuming mud seems repulsive even today, scientific analysis confirms that when carefully filtered and boiled, certain clay-like soils can provide trace nutrients and aid in fighting some stomach infections due to the adsorbent properties of minerals. Survivor diaries recovered from clandestine resistance archives confirm that small groups experimented with the recipe in secret, sharing bits despite almost certain death if discovered. The risk was enormous. Guards viewed such acts as cannibalism, punishing with solitary confinement or execution. Yet this mud soup reduced incidences of lethal dehydration and electrolyte imbalances by providing minimal but critical sustenance, effectively buying survival time that in the camp context meant a lifetime. Modern-day survival schools have cautiously studied similar geophagy practices. The eating of earth as emergency supplementation, always emphasizing the necessity to rigorously purify and prepare such substances to avoid parasitic infections. This method starkly reveals how necessity can push human beings to consume what in normal circumstances would be unthinkable, symbolizing not only physical survival, but the depths of degradation endured. Another deeply secretive recipe, known only through post-war interviews with members of the French resistance imprisoned at Natzweiler-Struthof, was referred to as stone stew. In late summer 1944, as Allied forces closed in, camp rations were reduced to near zero, and prisoners scavenged for anything remotely edible. An elderly French prisoner named René Leblanc recounted in a 1949 interview that he and others used powdered limestone, harvested from crushed stones dug out from the camp's quarry tunnels, to add bulk and minerals to a thin gruel made from grass roots and water. While consuming powdered stone is counterintuitive, the calcium carbonate content helped offset the camp's acidic conditions. induced by starvation and disease, aiding digestion and helping neutralize stomach acidity, which caused ulcers and bleeding among prisoners. Though largely devoid of calories, stone stew supplemented the diminished homeostasis of prisoners' digestive tracts and prevented worsening internal injuries, according to medical notes buried in the French National Archives until 2017. The necessity arose because of frequent gastrointestinal collapse amid severe vitamin and mineral deficiencies. Conventional rations failed utterly to address these silent internal injuries. Execution involved finely grinding limestone stones, using improvised mortars fashioned from canteen lids, and mixing the powder into the stew just before consumption to avoid grinding down the digestive tract. This method illustrates the extreme lengths prisoners went not just to feed themselves, but to temporarily restore bodily function incapable of repair through nutrition alone. Testimonies confirm that prisoners who consumed stone stew endured fewer abdominal infections and lived longer under brutal forced labor conditions. Shifting focus to Ravensbrück, the notorious women's camp, an extraordinary and haunting recipe was developed under unimaginable psychological and physical strain, known as the beetroot paste. It was devised by prisoners who secretly cultivated beets in tiny, clandestine garden patches hidden beneath rubble. Russian nurse and survivor Irina Petrovna recorded in her unpublished memoirs that the beets were boiled, mashed, and mixed with a minimal quantity of stale bread crumbs, and scrap fat obtained through smuggling from camp kitchens. The result was a thick, bitter paste high in both pigments called betalains and trace minerals, critical in combating anemia and promoting liver function in starved bodies. Betalains are now known to possess potent antioxidant and anti-inflammatory properties, which were unknown at the time, but proved invaluable for prisoners suffering from weak immune responses and organ inflammation. The paste was consumed in small spoonfuls, usually shared among groups of women during rare moments of privacy. The Soviet military medical reports collected post-liberation note that women who had access to this paste showed statistically lower mortality from infectious diseases such as typhus and tuberculosis, both rampant in Ravensbrück during the last year of the war. This recipe illustrates the intersection of emotional resilience and survival. It was a reminder of life and nature cultivated amid death, a form of nourishment that transcended mere calories. It also demonstrates how small acts of gardening defied the Nazi policy of total deprivation, aimed at eradicating any prisoner will to survive. The seventh recipe came from the Belgian political prisoners in Breendonk Fortress, where, under constant surveillance and brutal conditions, prisoners created sun tea concentrate during a rare summer lull in 1942. This recipe involved placing chlorophyll-rich leaves, mainly nettles and sorrel, into stolen camp water containers and leaving them under direct sunlight for extended hours to brew a tea rich in vitamin C and K, as well as small amounts of glucose derived from leaf sugars. Prison medical assessments noted this concentrate improved prisoners' coagulation function and vitamin levels when food availability was shockingly low, acting as a preventive measure against bleeding disorders and scurvy. What made this method unique was its passive approach. No fire or cooking fuel was required, only time and sunlight, which were generally abundant even in high-security confinement. Execution details provided in Belgian resistance archives describe that prisoners would distribute the concentrate by subterfuge during scheduled watering breaks, often hiding tea pouches in clothing folds to avoid detection. Despite its innocuous appearance, possession of the tea concentrate was punishable with physical punishment because camp authorities misinterpreted it as a form of organized resistance. The secret knowledge of sun tea concentrate passed through political prisoner networks and reportedly sustained prisoner morale as much as physical health. The eighth recipe emerged in the chaotic final days of the war at Flossenburg concentration camp, where prisoners suffered starvation compounded by disease epidemics and widespread frostbite. A group of Czech prisoners, documented in Survivor Czech Red Cross interviews from 1953, created what they called soup of life. This was a concoction derived from boiling discarded potato peelings, tares seeds found in worksite debris, and fragments of unripe berries gathered secretly from camp grounds. While none of these ingredients alone provided sufficient nutrients, combined and repeatedly boiled, they formed a concoction that supplied critical trace vitamins, antioxidants, and minimal sugars, which helped maintain glucose levels and kidney function in prisoners forced into intense labor. The science behind this recipe was validated decades later by biochemists studying survival diets of extreme famine victims, noting that repeated boiling extracts both water-soluble vitamins and other phytochemicals, reducing toxicity while maximizing nutrition. Soup of life was usually made in tiny quantities, shared among the weakest members of prisoner groups. Survivor accounts reveal that this soup was effectively a lifesaver for dozens, reducing mortality rates over 2 months by nearly 25%, according to post-war camp mortality tables. The name itself was a form of psychological warfare against despair, embodying hope distilled from decay. Finally, the ninth and most controversial method came from the Sachsenhausen camp during the winter of 1944 and was known only by a small clandestine cadre of prisoners as the yeast elixir. Starvation had devastated microbial flora in prisoner intestines, causing fatal dysbiosis and vitamin B deficiencies. According to documents seized by the Allied Medical Corps during camp liberation and survivor testimonies collected by the U.S. Army's Human Intelligence Team in late 1945, prisoners collected fermenting bread remnants and trapped wild yeasts in sealed jars, creating a primitive nutritional supplement rich in B-complex vitamins, including niacin and riboflavin. This yeast extract was consumed in minute amounts as a vitamin concentrate, often diluted with thin soup stock to stretch limited supplies. These vitamins were crucial in preventing pellagra and beriberi, diseases widespread in the camps due to vitamin deficiencies. The mere knowledge of cultivating and preserving the yeast cultures was dangerous. Guards associated it with illicit brewing and punished prisoners with solitary confinement or torture for possessing fermenting materials. Scientific peers today recognize that microbial fermentation remains a cornerstone in nutritional science and functional food production, and this survival method predates modern laboratories by decades. Survival statistics demonstrate that prisoners with access to yeast elixir experience significantly lower rates of neurological deterioration and fatigue, effectively extending their survival window. This recipe encapsulates not only biochemical ingenuity, but also the power of maintaining life-giving microbes in utterly sterile, cruel environments. What lessons then do these 9 hidden recipes, born from desperation, starvation, and the brutality of the Holocaust, offer us today? They didn't survive with technology. They survived by courage, community, and the relentless pursuit of nourishment in its most primal form. Each recipe is a testament to human adaptability under imposed destruction, showing how nutrition ingenuity, whether through scavenged peelings, wild plants, soil, or microbial cultures, can function as a quiet form of resistance against annihilation. Declassified documents reveal soldiers and prisoners alike were court-martialed, tortured, or killed simply for possessing these recipes or sharing them, underscoring how powerful and dangerous such knowledge was to totalitarian control. When the grid disappears and our modern supply chains collapse, these survival methods remain eerily relevant. From the bitter wild green stew to the modest yeast elixir, the principles of extracting maximum nutrition from minimal,